to move, particularly in the summer, to Pune, and he built this incredible synagogue with the steeple, and it's called Ohel David, the tent of David, David Sassoon, and it's in Pune. And they had, recently they had this 150th anniversary celebration. Oh, so in 2014 they had 150, so you can work out that that was 1864 that he built it, which figures. And yes, it was called Lal Dawal. They call it Lal Dawal. And this was, I was invited to this 150th anniversary. But if anybody has seen pictures or been to Britain, that is really, really looks like a church, with particularly the red brick. The thing is that Sir David Sassoon, he ordered the Raja's architects, the best British architects, just like the princes, to build him this monument. And it's just exactly like a church. Of course, it hasn't got a cross inside it or anything, but it's just so extraordinary. He was so influenced by the British. So what happened was that he had a lot of children, and some of his children became extremely anglicized and took up various habits like horse racing and all sorts of things of the elite, and became less orthodox. And so David Sassoon was very upset by some of his descendants. The most outrageous was Sir Victor Sassoon, who was a well-known playboy and left for Hong Kong and managed to flounder, I don't know, billions and billions of, it wasn't dollars in those days, pounds, and on all sorts of ridiculous ideas like horses and all sorts of other things. And he managed to actually dig into the ground some of the businesses that his parents and uncles had set up. But anyway, so in Pune you have a community of Baghdadis. When Sir David moved over, synagogue, you all know, is only built if you have more than 10 men, a quorum. And so there was a community in Pune as well. So the Baghdadis actually lived in 3 places: Calcutta, Bombay, and Pune. Now, one of the more famous ones, whom you know, is General Jacob, who lived in Delhi. I took 2 photographs of him, one when he was younger and was negotiating the war with Bangladesh. He single-handedly managed to get the Bangladesh or East Pakistan to surrender, and he wrote quite a famous book about it, and he died exactly a year ago. And here, this is how I sort of knew him, he was kind of older. In his latter years, after he retired from the army, he he joined the BJP party, became a governor of Goa, and then afterwards the governor of Punjab. And many of you may have heard of him, particularly because he's from Delhi. But he's a typical Baghdadi, a successful one, admittedly, but a Baghdadi. And to think that they only started coming at the end of the 19th century to India. Now, what's important about General Jacob is that while he was obviously very loyal to India, and in fact is one of India's heroes, he outwardly said that he was Jewish. He never covered this up ever in any circumstances. And he used to go to the synagogue that you visit on your course. He used to go every Saturday, every Friday night, in fact, they have a service. Every Friday night. If I used to go there and he would meet him there, definitely. So this is different from what goes on in Europe, where people become so successful and assimilated and then they stop going to the synagogue. No, he continued to go. And another one who's rather interesting is Commander Jack Jafford, who is 102. He's still alive. And here he is when he was younger. And this is at my symposium. He came. I actually had it on an audio, which won't transfer at all. And he came in this wheelchair, And if you can see in the smaller picture, he's holding a microphone and he's singing Sabbath songs and quite happy singing in Hebrew Sabbath songs. Here you have another example of a highly successful Baghdadi Jew in India who again was observed, knew all the prayers and the Hebrew prayers off by heart and knew to pray in Hebrew, as well as, of course, he knows Hindi, he knows everything. And I should mention that the Baghdadi's language is not Marathi and is not necessary. I mean, if they lived in Bombay, they spoke Marathi, but their language is Judeo-Arabic. It's a particular dialect of Arabic, extremely literary. As I mentioned, they had a huge seat of Jewish learning. And once they got to Calcutta, they opened a Hebrew press there, which was already working and opened in 1846, and some very important books in Judeo-Arabic were published in Calcutta, in Hebrew, and in Judeo-Arabic. Judeo-Arabic is it's like if you've heard of Yiddish, which is a sort of dialect of German for Jews, so Judeo-Arabic is the dialect of Arabic for Sephardi Jews. Okay, next one. So now we turn to Calcutta, which is always overwhelming. Yes, right. Next slide. Even here, you can see the architecture of, there were, in their heyday, before partition, there were 10 synagogues and prayer halls of Jews in Calcutta. The vast majority were actually Baghdadis. There were two major synagogues. One is the Magen David synagogue, and again it's very similar. It's less pronounced than the Pune one, which was really crazy, but it's still, I mean, it also looks like a church to me, and it's got a little steeple and the red brick, the British red brick. It's still influenced by the British style, there's no doubt about it. So this is the first one in Calcutta, and then the next one. Oh, this is the interior. It's a beautiful synagogue. It's very lavish. Today it's got no people in it, and they've shut it. I think this year they shut it. Until recently they were alternating between this synagogue and the next synagogue, which is called Bet El Synagogue, and they had I mentioned about a quorum. It's called in Hebrew a minyan. They had a service in one week in one synagogue and 1 week in the other synagogue, and now I think that this one is largely shut anyway. And this is the other synagogue in Bet-El. It's similar architecture again. At the very end is the ark which contains the Torah scrolls. And you have the women sitting up in the gallery. As mentioned, the Baghdadis were Orthodox Jews. There's no such thing as Reform Baghdadi Jews. They're Orthodox Jews, and this is their synagogue. Thank you. But of course, the Baghdadis' women were very important. So one of the members of the Baghdadi, our Calcutta community is Esther Abraham, who was Miss India, 1947. I just love, first of all, she's really beautiful, but besides that, she's also a symbol of India. I mean, in the same way that bricks and mortars, the gateway of India in Bombay, is a symbol of India to Indians and to foreigners who look at India. So Esther Abraham was the first Miss India. And in fact, she wasn't of Indian origin. She was a Baghdadi Jewess. And even if you say, well, she's Indian, she was born in India, I mean, she was only there for 2 generations. So it's really, really extraordinary that she became Miss India. There have been various articles recently about the film actresses and film actors who are of Baghdadi origin, also Ben Israel origin, and why they produced so many actors and actresses. And some of the academics think it's because these women particularly, but there were also men, like David was a Ben Israel actor, very famous in all the silent movies. because they were marginalized, their position in society was marginalized. And certainly somebody like Esther Abraham, look, I mean, she's going sleeveless, and she dared to do what perhaps more mainstream Hindu women would not dare to do, and that's, you know, go out there and be a model and be Miss India. Today it doesn't look very very unusual, but I'm sure in 1947 this was considered a bit what English people call risque, a bit dodgy there. And she's really a figurehead. And I put in the corner a picture of Flower Silliman, who is one of the last Jews in Calcutta. She lived in, I remember she had a Baghdadi kosher restaurant in Jerusalem. At a certain stage they lived in Jerusalem, and she decided to go back and live in Calcutta along with her daughter Yael, who had migrated to the US, to the United States. And 5 years ago Yael decided to move back to Calcutta, and I would like you to write this down. She's set up a brilliant a digital site called jewishcalcutta.in, and it's got all sorts of information, particularly if you're interested in the Jews of India. It's got all sorts of information which a regular bibliography wouldn't be able to give you, an academic bibliography. And she's really becoming an authority on Calcutta Baghdadi Jewry. She's particularly interested in Baghdadi Jewry from a feminist perspective, and so she's writing quite a lot about that, but it's really interesting. I think that was, is there any more? Yeah, that's the, okay, conclusions, also conclusions. The Baghdadi Jews in India really don't exist anymore. There are just, I mean, there are a few hundred, maybe several hundred, either in Calcutta or Bombay. Few in Pune, but they live on in name. Everybody's heard of the Sassoons, really, and the cities, I mean, and in what I call rock and mortar. I mean, their monuments remain. And so their legacy in India is quite strong. Their financial prowess was so great that they could afford to set up these monuments which made their name live on. They were what I call an ephemeral community, associated with the Raj, but not of it. So it's interesting that the British allowed the Baghdadis into their clubs. You know these clubs, the Saturday club, the Sunday club, whatever they have. So these were, in the time of the British, they wouldn't let the Ben Israel go into their clubs, even though they let them into the army, because they were too Indian. But the Baghdadis, although they weren't exactly lily white in color skin, they were from Iraq, they were allowed in because they could play tennis there and do all those things that the British did, because they were the right class. And their contribution to India is really quite considerable. It's even beyond rock and mortar, because you have figureheads like Esther Abraham or General Jacob or what have you. There are many others whose figurehead is really very great. Now, I want to now move on. That's the end of the PowerPoint presentation, and I want to now discuss the relationship between the Baghdadis whom you've seen now and the Ben Israel whom you've learnt, and what was the relationship between the two of them, these two Jewish communities, because the course is on diversity and identity among Jews in India. And you can see that it's just a different kettle of fish. The Ben Israel come from the Konkan, they were oil pressers. They gradually moved up in Bombay. Some of them became educated, some of them became professors. But we're talking of a different type of Jew. And then you have the Baghdadi Jews, there were poor ones, many poor ones, but there were these hugely rich, powerful leaders. And what happened was there was a clash between the Baghdadis and the Ben Israel. It's really very obvious if you took of it in academic terms. So we'll take the period of David Sassoon. There was another one called Sir David Sassoon. David Sassoon, coming into Bombay in 1832. We've already said in our lecture on the Ben Israel that the first Ben Israel synagogue was set up in 1796. And more Ben Israel were coming into Bombay and setting up more synagogues. So one day, one of the Ben Israel thought, oh, well, we'll try out the new synagogue that David Sassoon set up, the blue synagogue called Knesset Eliyahu. And they weren't welcome there. The Baghdadis made it very, very clear that no dark-skinned Indians could come into their synagogue because they were the true Jews, they were the pure Jews, they had great Jewish learning. And what did the Ben Israel know about Judaism? I should point out that neither group had rabbis, but the Baghdadis had a great Iraqi rabbis in Iraq, and they would write letters and ask questions about Judaism, and so they were extremely learned. And they said, sorry, you, Ben Israel, cannot come into our synagogue. The Ben Israel, of course, said, oh, well, we didn't really want to in the first place, but it became more problematic when they set up the JJ Hospital, and they made a special wing. I said Jewish philanthropy, and they said this can be a Jewish wing for if anybody's ill, they should have first preference in this hospital. So the Ben Israel were also ill. So they came along and said they wanted medical help. And the Baghdadi said, well, we don't accept you in the synagogues. And with a big favor, they said, okay, the Ben Israel, because they really have a good heart, we'll tend to the sick in the hospital and in the Jewish wing. But it was a big thing. It was a big deal. Meanwhile, we've said, David Sassoon set up that steeple synagogue in Pune. And there were already Ben Israel in Pune. They'd come with the British. They were serving in the army particularly. And the Ben Israel wanted to be, on the Sabbath, we read the Torah, the portion of the Torah. They wanted to go up to the Torah and read the portion. Baghdadi said no. So the Ben Israel set up their own synagogue in Pune. This all rippled effect went on until Rangoon, which was part of the British India at the time. In 1937, Ben Israel said he insists on reading the Torah in the Baghdadi synagogue. There aren't enough Ben Israel in Rangoon, and he's going to go to synagogue, and he's going to read the Torah in the synagogue. And the Baghdadis said, no, you're not really truly Jewish, and you can't do it. And he went to the British High Court, and he made a civil case against the Baghdadis, and he won it. And then the Baghdadis had to let this guy in Rangoon go up and read the Torah. But there's no question that in Calcutta and Bombay and Pune, there was tremendous friction over the alleged superiority of the Baghdadis and their alleged greater purity as Jews than the Ben Israel. Now, there are different ways in which we can interpret this. But one of the ways is to say that this was also a replication of the wider society and replication of this jati system, whereby the Baghdadis were the higher caste, also wealthier, but the higher caste, and the Ben Israel were the lower caste. I've mentioned already that the Ben Israel were in themselves divided into Gor and Kala, white and black. This was not a reflection of their own color. It was not color. And they were, the difference between Gora and Kala amongst the Ben Israel was who was in the original shipwreck. It's quite interesting. And so they're saying that the black Ben Israel, they're not really black, but the black Ben Israel didn't really come in the original shipwreck, and only we Gora came in the original shipwreck. But I must confess that that division has in fact died out in the 20th century. But the real division that remained was between the Baghdadis and the Ben Israel. And there were really, really no intermarriages between these communities, although they were all Jews. And don't forget, these Jews could not marry Hindus or Muslims because it was against religion, and also the Hindus and Muslims didn't want to marry the Jews because that also wasn't done. And there were 1 or 2 cases of a Baghdadi who married a Ben Israel, and often the Baghdadi married the Ben Israel girl, and often was quite ostracized by his own community. There were cases of that, and it was really frowned upon. There were a few cases, and they're well known, but it was unusual, very, very unusual. And so they led separate lives, but on the other hand, at certain points in their existence, the lives had to cross. For example, if a Ben Israel was out of work and he needed employment, the Baghdadi, as a Jew, would say, okay, you can come and work in the textile mill in Bombay. You has got no money. He must come and work with us. And they gave him money. Now, the Baghdadis set up 2 very big schools in Bombay and also in Calcutta, but I'll just talk now about Bombay, for Jewish children. They had separate education in which the children learnt English and Judeo-Arabic and Hebrew. One of the schools was set up by a very famous rich Baghdadi family called the Kaduris. You probably read in international relations Eli Kaduri's book on nationalism. He was actually my tutor at one stage at the London School of Economics. The Kaduris set up the Sir Eli Kaduri School. And they had a positive quota for Jewish children, and they accepted Ben Israel as well as Baghdadi. What happened was that over the years, something interesting happened, that the Baghdadis became so successful that they already didn't want to go to the Jewish schools. They wanted to send their children off to England, to public schools there. So they were sending their children off to these very smart schools, and there were less Baghdadi children and more Ben Israel. And then and the Ben Israel were becoming more and more educated. I mentioned a professor here, a professor there. So the headmistress of the Sir Eli Kaduri School in the 1940s and 50s was a Ben Israel called Flora Samuel, who was a very educated lady. She, in fact, ended up teaching Sanskrit at the Hebrew University, very educated. But she was a Ben Israel. But everybody respected her already. The Baghdadis had to respect her. And the Baghdadis went less and less to their own schools. Now, in 2017, we've mentioned there are fewer Baghdadis, there are less Ben Israel. There is a school, the Israelite school, in the compound of the Magen David synagogue. It's a very big compound. And there isn't a single Jewish student there, a single Jewish pupil there. Because there were very few people of the younger generation, and the vast majority, over 90%, are Muslim. So you have a fascinating situation in 2017, that this school is looked after by Jews, it's also paid for by Jews, and yet nearly all the pupils are Muslim. Probably the only country in the world where such a thing happens, this is the realities. Now, the friction between the Ben Israel and the Baghdadis, which could be interpreted in a caste framework, could be, well, I'll wait to hear what you have to say about that, but this hung over and had its after effects when the two groups moved on to Israel. Actually, most of the Baghdadis went to other countries too, but some of them ended up in Israel, in the state of Israel after 1948. And I've mentioned that the Baghdadis were very religious and well-learned Jews, and that most of the chief rabbis in Israel have been of Iraqi Baghdadi origin. And so guess what? When the Bene Israel came to live in Israel in the 1950s, they weren't too happy. What was their reaction to the Bene Israel? No, you're still not pure Jews, you're not regular Jews, you cannot be accepted here in the state of Israel. And that will be the description of what happened to them will be the lecture that I will be giving, lecture number 9, on religious discrimination, racism, and acceptance in the new state, because largely the discrimination against the Bene Israel stemmed from the Indian situation. It was a hangover of the friction with the Baghdadi Jews, which was hung over both from Bombay and from Calcutta, and a little bit, of course, from Pune, and it moved over into a new territory, which was the State of Israel. So what I've done today is I've given you really an insight into, you asked what are the origins of these people, what were they like. You can see that they're so different, the Bene Israel and the Baghdadis, and yet their paths crossed, and sometimes it wasn't so fortuitous. Today, the Baghdadis have no problems with the Bene Israel because they don't have any alternative. If you go to the Knesset Eliyahu synagogue in Bombay, the people running the synagogue are from the Bene Israel. There aren't any Baghdadis that can run it and sing the songs and do all that. And they're so happy if a Bene Israel comes to their synagogue. They really are happy. So we've discussed 2 of the major groups of Indian Jews. And with that, we'll probably move to the question and answer session. And tomorrow we'll focus on South India, which is, again, a different ball game. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor White. Just to flag some of the issues you talked about. You know, if you look at the civil service, there is 2 types of cadre. One is the IAS cadre, the other one what you call promoting. Okay? And you always have this, you know, I originally got through a UPSC exam, you are promoted because of 30 years. We always have this, you know, who is the original person? We always have this history. So, you know, each one is right from the point of